My name is Beth Borman. I'm from CorVel Corporation from the United States. What do we do? So CorVel, we do workers' compensation insurance. Not sure if anybody here knows what that is, but workers' compensation makes sure that if you are injured on the job, you get the wages and medical benefits that you are owed. At CorVel, we do that through a number of different ways. We have adjusters who will handle your claim for you. So they make sure that the laws are followed. We have case management nurses who will make sure that you are getting the care that you need, the medical care. We do medical bill review. So when your providers send in bills, we make sure that they are getting paid what they are owed. We also do things like radiology and physical therapy scheduling, pharmacy benefit management, things like that. So we have a number of different business lines and business processes. And what I do at the company is I work for the software development area. I work with a group of people who make the software that all of those other people in the company use to make sure that the injured workers get well and get back to work. So regardless of what business process in CorVel we're talking about, we have universal goals. We want to achieve better outcomes. So we want to make sure that if you are injured at work, that you get well. You get back to the state you were in before you were injured. We want to provide better service. So if you're our customer, we want to make sure that you are happy with the service we're providing. And we want to decrease costs, both to our customers and to ourselves. And we want to increase productivity. And so these are the three goals that we keep in mind when we look at any of our business processes. And we're going to look at two of our business processes today. So the first one we're going to look at is our bill review process, our medical bill review process. And this is a good example of what we're calling a linear process. So it's very straightforward. We receive a bill, we prepare it for processing. It goes through our software system, we review and process that bill, and then we issue a payment to the provider. It's very straightforward. The process is always the same. There are very few variations. It's not really influenced by any external factors. So it's pretty straightforward. So how did we approach mining this process? Well, there are 4 steps we generally went through. So we captured our expected process. We analyzed the whole process at once from start to finish. We could look at the big picture. We focused on optimization. So we looked at identifying any bottlenecks or exceptions to the process, things where it didn't follow what we were expecting. And then we discussed our results with the domain experts. So linear processes like this is a great place to use the theory of constraints for analyzing. So theory of constraints, you want to focus on ways to increase your throughput through the process, reduce the amount of inventory that's waiting to move through your process, and reduce the expense of your process. And so we did this for our bill review process by using the DISCO tool to identify our main bottleneck or a limiting factor or constraint. And so you can see right there, the big red arrow between those 2 milestones, that was our first limiting factor that we identified. And so essentially what we did is we focused right in that area. And we said, all right, we need to work in this particular area to get rid of this bottleneck. Once you do that, then you run the process again through the process mining. You identify your next limiting factor or constraint, and you focus on that area to reduce that bottleneck, and you keep going through the process again and again and again. So, our results, well, but going back to our 3 universal goals, so for decreasing costs and increasing our productivity, so through our process mining for this process, we were able to automate some of the steps that were previously being done by humans. And we were able to identify some redundant steps, so things that were being done more than once, and some obsolete steps, things that didn't need to be done any longer, and we were able to remove them from our process. Providing better service. By streamlining our process, we were able to reduce the amount of time that it took a bill to go through from start to finish to 1 day, which led to faster payment for our providers, and achieve better outcomes. By automating some of those steps that were previously done by humans, that led to greater accuracy, less chances for mistakes, and greater savings for our customers. So in summary, for linear processes, for a linear process, you'll generally have a standard flow, a standard design. It'll be a strong design. So it will follow the same process. It will have very few exceptions, not a lot of influence from external factors, so things outside of your control. And you will approach analyzing that linear process by looking at the whole picture. So you can look at it from start to finish. You'll generally be looking to optimize the process, looking for bottlenecks, things like that. Or you might be looking for conformance to that process. So maybe you're looking for any spots where things are going outside of your expected process. And it's a great place to apply the theory of constraints. And some results that you might get from analyzing a linear process is you might see increased throughput, and you might see greater compliance in your process. Uh-oh. Here we go. Our second business process that we're going to look at today is our claims management workflow. And this is basically the opposite of a linear process. This is what we're calling a high complex workflow. For claims management, we know the starting point, a person gets injured at work, and we know the hopeful ending point, they get better and they go back to work. But all of the things in between could happen many different ways. An example, or an analogy, is Google Maps. So you know where you're starting, and you know where you want to go. But there are many routes that you could take. And it could be influenced by things like traffic, or construction on the road, or maybe a stop that you plan to make along the way. And our claims management workflow is very similar. So there are many steps that could happen in the middle. So things like doctor's visits, maybe a surgery, maybe there's litigation where the injured worker gets an attorney and takes us to court. Perhaps the injured worker goes back to work and realizes they don't feel as well as they thought that they did. So now they're off work again. Many different things could happen in the life of a claim. And every claim is different, and every injured worker is different. And therefore, it can be very difficult to analyze a claim. So, for a high complex process, you're looking at processes that are not standard. They don't follow a predictable pathway. They are probably influenced by many factors which are out of your control. They have high variations. And so how can you approach process mining for a complex process like this? Well, here's what we did. First, we had to determine which perspectives we could use to analyze this. So what is the case ID? What is the activity? Next, we tried exploring smaller pieces of the workflow. So not the entire picture at once, but maybe we could look at smaller segments of the workflow. We focused on finding patterns, not necessarily bottlenecks. And again, we discussed with domain experts, so people who are very familiar with the ins and outs of a claim, and had them help us understand what we were looking at. What you see here, this picture of this disco map, this was the picture of one segment, one small segment of our claims workflow. This is just a picture of what happens when we get a claim at the very beginning. And you can see how complex it is, and nothing has really happened yet. This injured worker hasn't even visited a doctor for the first time yet. So we had to get creative. We had to think of different ways to look at this information, because if we tried to look at a claim, we were going to have to look at the whole picture of a claim. It was going to be impossible. So we had to think of a different way. So we thought, thanks to Rudy, let's try looking at an adjuster or a user in our system instead of a claim. Maybe that would be easier. So we made a user our case ID. Well, as you can see, it really wasn't much better. And we had kind of had the same problem in that no two users work the same way. Just like no two claims are the same, no two users work the same way. Again, they're doing some of the same activities, but they're not doing them at the same times. They're not doing them for every claim that they're working on. They're working on multiple claims at the same time. So we ran into a similar problem as when we had a claim as our case ID. It's kind of a spaghetti pile. So we had to think even more creatively. So we decided to compare users. So we added the day to the case ID along with the user. So now we've got two attributes as our case ID. We have the user and the day, and we're comparing users side by side. So we're looking at a day in the life of a user side by side. And this is great because now we can start to identify patterns. We can say, all right, so we're looking at 3 different users. What can we see here? Do we see anything that looks similar about them? Can we start to see things that are jumping out at us that might give us some information? And what we saw, you can see by the red arrows here, we saw this particular activity, activity 5, was common among these adjusters. It was something that they're doing quite a bit of. So now we're seeing a pattern. And now we're seeing an activity that we can start to optimize We're seeing an area in the system that all of these adjusters are using frequently. And it gives us a hint of a place where we can start. An area in our software that we can go and start to work on to make their jobs easier. But it's a starting place. It's not the ending place. We said, okay, this is a good picture, but how could we break this down further? What other information could we learn? So what we did is we took one of these users and we broke it down further. So now what we did is we included the day of the week as part of the activity. So now we have the user and the day as the case ID, and we have the day of the week included in the activity, and we're looking at one user with each day of the week that we're comparing here. So now we're starting to see, all right, when we're looking at how they're working on each day of the week, what patterns can we see? Is there a particular activity that they're doing more of on a Monday? For example, are we getting more documents in on Monday because of the mail that stacks up over the weekend? Are they saving some particular tasks for the end of the week? Is there any changes we could make to our business process to spread things out more evenly? And we can look at this breakdown for many users to see if we can identify patterns across the board. So the results of our process mining for our claims management process, our high complex process, going back to our universal goals again, decrease costs and increase productivity. Well, we gained greater understanding of our assumed process. So for a high complex process, it's very difficult to really know what you've got going on. So you're making a lot of assumptions about what your process is. And process mining really gives you a picture into what's really going on. And you're finding opportunities for optimization. So when you can start to identify patterns, you can start to figure out where in your system you can go, or your process, to start optimizing pieces of it and making that work easier. Provide better service. We were able to identify specific areas in our process to increase training and compliance for our users. And achieve better outcomes. So by beginning to identify a common path or a most used path, we can start to streamline this particular path, guide users towards this path, and thereby optimize and reduce their busy work, which gives them more time to actually focus on the patient instead of all of this extraneous stuff they've got going on. So, in summary, depending on the type of process you're looking at, you need to tailor your approach. So for a linear process, how do you know if it's a linear process you're looking at? Well, it's a known process. It's well-defined. It follows a standard path, not many variations, not influenced by external factors, so generally you have a lot of control of the process. How do you know if you have a high complex process? Well, it's probably not sequential or well-defined or predictable. There's a lot of variations. It's influenced by things that might be out of your control. How can you approach analyzing these processes? If it's a linear process, you can approach the whole thing at once. You can see the whole picture, the big picture. You can use the theory of constraints, looking for the bottlenecks, improving your throughput, reducing your inventory. For high complex, you've got to be creative. Think of different views you could take. Think of different ways you could slice and dice your look. For linear processes, you're probably focusing on optimization or conformance to your process. And for high complex, you're focusing on understanding your process, truly seeing what it is. And you're identifying patterns and standardizing what you can standardize. I hope this helps you pick the right approach for your process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Think of questions for Beth, and I'll start with the first one. So you mentioned that you're coming from a software development process perspective, right? And I'm wondering, in this area, traditionally, aren't there business analysts or people who also try to understand how the users work, right? So that they can understand the system and improve it. So how did you find your process mining approach in relation to, let's say, the traditional way of working?
Good question. So the question was, I'm coming from a software development group, and we traditionally have business analysts who do similar work in understanding business processes. And how did we do process mining? How did we fit that in with the business analysts? So we have a group of project managers, business analysts, and data analysts that all work together. And so a lot of the business analysts are actually doing process mining. It's part of our, I would say, project planning and requirements research analysis. So whenever we start a new project, whenever we're starting the requirements analysis piece, process mining is part of it, because we want to really understand what is it that we are trying to enhance, what are we trying to change. We try to get a good understanding of the current process before we make any changes to it.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's get a microphone over there.
Hello? Oh, yes, it works. My name is Hessam. I'm new to process mining. You showed one slide with different processes per user per day. Yes. And you said, well, you have to find the patterns. I was looking at a slide and I was thinking, I don't see the patterns. As someone who is new to process mining, can you please tell us what these patterns are?
Sure.
If you can go back to the slide.
Let me see if I can get back there.
Yeah.
This one.
Yeah.
So in this one, so this is for one user that we're looking at for multiple days of the week. And I think when you will see the pattern is when you're comparing multiple users looking at the days of the week. So you would have this view, and you'd be looking at this view for multiple users.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yes, that makes sense. But if you look at it from one user perspective only, would you be able to detect a pattern?
You might be able to. I think it depends what you're looking for. So what we are trying to look for when we're analyzing our claims workflow is we're trying to detect commonalities across users. So for us, it makes more sense to compare a week in the life of a user for more than one user, because we're trying to detect patterns across multiple users. It depends on your use case, right?
Right.
Doesn't sound like I'm answering your question.
Actually, I need like, I'm looking like a practical example. I think the previous slides had like the sheet with the multiple users, but I think we're going to too much detail. Maybe save that for later.
This one?
I think with there's different users.
These are different users.
Okay,
yes.
Right. So let's say I'm a business analyst, right? And I'm looking at this sheet, and I'm trying to find patterns.
Yes.
What are the things that I should look for?
Sure. So what you can actually see a pattern here. It's a little hard to tell because you can't actually read the squares. But I've indicated with the red arrows. I don't know if you can see the red arrows.
I see them.
Okay. So what you can see from the red arrows is these three events in all three users. They're a dark blue, which means they happen frequently. And because they happen frequently on all three of these users, and it's the same event, that means it's common.
Okay.
All three users are doing it a lot. So what that tells me is that's an area of our process that's frequent across users. And so if I'm looking for an area in my software to optimize, or a place where I want to go to somehow make this work easier, or maybe automate something so that they don't have to do it manually, that would be a good place to start, because all three of these users are doing that particular activity very frequently.
Okay, thank you very much for answering my question.
Okay.
Anyone else?
I think we had a question over there. Yes?
Is that, yeah. Catch it?
Whoa.
Quick question. You mentioned one of the objectives of this whole exercise was to cut costs.
Yes.
Are you allowed to give some kind of an indication as to how much you actually save? Maybe not the absolute number, but the relative number. How much were you actually able to save with this exercise in money?
Okay, the question was, one of our goals was to reduce costs, and how much did we actually reduce the costs, and how much did we actually save? I actually can't give you that number because it's in salaries, so I don't actually know that number.
Relative number, 2%, 3% less, or something.
Yeah, I don't actually know the number, so I'm sorry, I can't tell you.
Okay.
Hiya. Just wondering, when you identify a process that requires more attention, you illustrated it with a thicker red line. When you want to get deeper into that process, are you running that back through the process mining again to dig deeper, or is that just meeting with stakeholders to understand the process and document everything?
Let me see if I understood the question. So I think you're asking, when we identify a bottleneck,
Yeah.
are we digging deeper through process mining, or are we meeting with stakeholders to further identify the process?
Yes.
Correct. Okay. So when we're looking at the linear process, let me try to go back to that slide. For example, here, when we've got this big bottleneck, and we want to try to fix this bottleneck, in our linear process, this is the process. So through process mining, we can't really go further. We could do, as the previous presenter was suggesting, with various filters and dig into the actual cases and see what's going on. But we also do other data analysis techniques as well to try to figure out what's happening. But we do meet with the expert, our subject matter experts, to talk to them to try to come up with solutions. And it depends on what the bottleneck is. If it's a system bottleneck, if it's an actual business process bottleneck.
I think there was one more question there in the corner. No? Oh. Okay, who has another question? Okay, Will.
Yeah, so thanks for the talk. So when you talk about linear, we typically call that lasagne, and highly complex, we call that spaghetti. But the conclusions are very, let's say, much related to the way that we talk about it. What I see in your talk, but also in the talk earlier of the police, I think one of the important use cases of process mining is the ability to compare different processes, right? And you're comparing people over different days, etc. But do you think that, like in the topic of comparative process mining is a big topic in research, but typically in commercial tools it is not really, let's say, explicitly supported. Is that also something that you feel? Because, for example, you show the different days and there was a person asking, what do I see? And you get very distracted by the layout algorithm that is putting one activity here and another activity there. That can be highly misleading. But if you would put them on top of each other, you would see exactly where the differences would be. Is that also your feeling or experience, or did you think about this problem?
So let me see if I understand. So is the question, when comparing users...
So the question is now you have to visually compare things.
Yep.
And that's very difficult because what you see visually is determined by the layout algorithm. While what you actually would like to see, I don't know, in this process, often this activity is at the beginning and another process is at the end, right?
I see. Yeah. So when you're visually comparing, let's say, multiple users, it can be distracting because although it's the same activities, the way that the tool might lay them out is the activities are in different places for each person. It can be distracting to me, but it's the way that the user works, so it's important, right? Especially for our processes, not every user does them in the same order. So while, if I go to the slide, so here where we have the red arrows, right? These are the steps that I'm saying each user has in common, and we can see they're not in the same position in each of these pictures. However, each user is doing them at a different point in the process, which makes sense because not each user does their work in a different order. They don't all have to start at the same place and they don't all have to end at the same place. So it makes sense that they're in a different place. It just means you have to look a little closer at what you're looking at. You can't just gloss over it. You really have to study the picture you're looking at.
Yeah. But just for you and the audience, there are, let's say, visualizations possible where you show one model and you can color arcs and nodes, for example, in red and green. Red is one process, green is the other process, and it's in gray if it's the same for both.
Oh.
Right, so then in one plot you immediately see, okay, this is a path that is taken by user A, but user B never takes that path. And
interesting.
I think that's helpful. You can also see that here, but it takes more effort to do that. Yeah.
I was not aware of that. That's interesting. But then it also takes away...
So it changed the requirement for the tool, right?
But then it also takes away then from being able to see the most common activities, because then it's a different color.
You focus on the differences, but for example, you could also make the coloring depending on performance, right? So what I just said was frequencies, but you can also say, in this process, the user is spending a lot of time in that part of the process, and another user is doing that differently. Yeah.
True, yeah.
Now Anne is angry.
No. Any more questions? Okay, one question in the back, and then we go to the next talk.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I had a question about how you were comparing the adjusters. Right now you're actually looking visually at A to C.
Yes.
But were you actually sampling, or were you actually comparing every user or grouping them in order to analyze how they were doing their work and to see whether there was a common happy flow, effective flow, or were you just like randomly sampling in order to see whether there was a pattern which was the most efficient?
Right. So this is just 3 for the picture, but you can do as many as you want. So when we're looking at them actually in the Disco tool, we're looking at many. We're not looking at all of them in our data set because we have hundreds. So we look at a group at a time. And we try to pick out the patterns in that group, make note of them, and then we look at a second group, pick out the patterns. We look at the patterns from the first group and see if they hold in the second group, and so forth. So it is a lot of work, but if you try to look at all of them side by side, it's quite difficult just because there are so many.
Thank you.
Let's thank Beth again. Thanks so much.
Thank you.